everyone, Miss Carrie here with another design team project for the Rabbit Hole Designs. Today I'm sharing a few layered stencil techniques. These card making projects are fun to create and allow you to experiment with your embossing powders, texture pastes, stencil butters, and other mixed media items you might have in your collection. I'm going to be using the mid-century modern stencil set. This is a 4-part stencil designed to layer together, but each one can also be used on its own. Each of these stencils is labeled with the stencil name, number, and the word top in the upper corner to help you align all your images. I have already cut some cardstock for my cards and gathered a few items in my mixed media collection. I'll be using pastes, butters, and embossing powders today, but you can use whatever you own to create these card backgrounds. The image I'm going to use is the one-line holly stamp. This is a lovely image that I'm going to be shading with watercolors for each of the cards. For the first background, I'm going to be using transparent gloss paste, distress embossing glaze, and this lovely frosted crystal powder. I'm going to use Stencil 1 and the all dots for this background. I'm going to start by prepping the cardstock with anti-static powder. Then I'll attach the stencil to the cardstock with repositionable tape. I'm going to apply some Versamark ink through the stencil. You can also use an embossing dauber if you have one. I'm just pressing the ink pad onto the stencil so that I get a really good coverage on the cardstock. Once I have added all of the ink, I'm going to remove the stencil and apply some of the embossing glaze to that ink. Now, if you happen to get a little bit of seepage under the stencil or some excess powder where you don't want it, just use a small paintbrush to remove it. Now I'm going to heat this with a heat tool, and you'll be able to see those lovely tone-on-tone dots appear on the cardstock. Once the powder is set, I'm going to add the snowflake or star images onto the cardstock with transparent gloss paste. Like the glaze, this is going to create another tone-on-tone design with a raised image. After I've applied the paste, I'm going to remove the stencil and sprinkle some of the frosted crystal embossing powder over the top. I'm going to quickly heat this with a heat tool just so that powder is set. I don't want to overheat this because it can cause that glaze to overheat. Once the texture paste has had time to set, it will become transparent and the frosted crystal will form a matte texture over the top. All right, I'm going to set this one aside and wash all of my stencils, and then I'm going to show you how to create the second background. For this one, I'm going to be using embossing powder once again, but I'm going to be using Stencil 2. Again, I'm going to prep my cardstock with anti-static powder, attach the stencil, and use Versamark ink to create the images. After the ink has been applied, I'm going to remove the stencil and sprinkle the cardstock with gold embossing powder, then heat set it with a heat tool. You could also use a tinsel gold embossing powder, which would give you some lovely texture, or you could create those gold dots with gold ink or glitter gel. All of those would create the same color, but give you a different texture and effect. After my gold powder is set, I'm going to use Stencil 3 with opaque texture paste to create the design. I'm going to line up the top corner of the cardstock and attach the stencil with repositionable tape, then I'll apply the paste to the stencil. Now you can see here we have 2 sets of dots on the paper. One is with gold embossing powder and the other is with paste. I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes before I add the snowflakes with texture paste. Again, I'm going to line up my stencil, attach it with tape, and then apply the texture paste to the cardstock. Now, I did want to make sure that those little dots were completely dry. If you try to apply this stencil while the texture paste is wet, it could flatten those little dots or cause them to smear, which would not give you a really great design. Now, when I remove this stencil, you can see we have this gorgeous design on green cardstock. This has a really great retro feel. All right, I'm going to go wash my stencils again, and then I'm going to show you how to create the third background. For this one, I'm going to be using the All Dots and Stencil 1 with stencil butter and texture paste. I've already attached the stencil to my cardstock, and I'm going to be using a silicone brush to apply turquoise stencil butter over the images. Now, stencil butter does have a little bit different texture than the texture paste. It has a thinner consistency with a deep opaque color. The butter is like modeling paste where it holds its shape, allowing you to create peaks and valleys. For a smoother application, I like using a silicone brush because I can easily smooth out any lines I don't want showing. Now, I did set this aside for about 30 minutes to let that color set because I didn't want to smudge it. And then I used some opaque texture paste and applied the images from Stencil 1, just like I did on the other backgrounds. All right, I'm going to show you how to add a little watercolor to your stamped images. I've gone ahead and stamped and heat embossed these images onto some watercolor cardstock using black embossing powder. And now I'm going to apply color to the images to match my backgrounds. The first holly image is going to be shaded with traditional green color to match that red background. I have painted some water onto the image so that I can do what is called a wet on wet technique. As I drop the pigment onto the holly leaf, the water is going to help it flow across the image. While that first layer of pigment dries, I'm going to add a layer of blue-green to the second holly leaf. This is going to match that blue background we created. The last set of leaves is going to be a craft color, which I know is non-traditional, but it's going to look lovely with that green and gold background. Now that the first layer of pigment has dried, I'm going to add a second layer of color to these images. This is going to add just a little bit more detail to the leaves and create some shadows on the images. Now, I do have a few videos on my channel showing how to use watercolors. This is something that is newer to me. When our children were little, I painted with acrylics, but then I took a break as life got busy. A few years ago, I started playing with watercolors, and it has taken me a little bit of time to get used to that free-flowing nature of the pigment. I'm still learning new techniques every time I use watercolors, and I really do enjoy sharing what I learn with you. Now, I am going through this rather quickly, and I'm skipping over quite a bit of the watercoloring, but you can see here that I am adding quite a bit of shading and highlights to the leaves. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera and add some colors to the berries, just like I did the leaves, and then I'll show you how to assemble the cards. You can see here that I finished adding color and I've trimmed those holly images down. On the green holly, I shaded the berries red and added some yellow. The brown holly bundle has gold and copper berries, and the teal holly has a soft purple shade. I've also stamped a second holly image here with a sentiment. I trimmed this down to the line so that I could layer another holly over it with some foam dots. I have also trimmed down those backgrounds I created to fit an A2 size card, and I've started assembling the cards. I've started with that tone-on-tone red card first. I adhered this onto a green background, and I'm going to be layering the white piece at the base, and then I'll be placing that holly image over the top on some foam tape. I am going to tuck a loop of silver thread behind the holly. This is just a sewing thread that I have in my collection, but you can use whatever you have to create a little thread bundle. On each of the snowflakes, I also am going to add a clear glitter gem. Now that the first card is complete, I'm going to work on the one with the green background. This card is not going to have a sentiment. I'll be stamping that phrase on the inside of the card because I like the simplicity of this design without a sentiment. I did tuck some gold thread behind the holly on this card before I adhered it in place. The final card is the bright blue one we created with the stencil butter. I love the contrast of color and texture on this one. Again, I'm leaving off the sentiment, but you can add one if you would like. The holly is being popped up on some foam tape to give it dimension, and then I'm going to add a few gems to each of these little circles on the cards. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the finished designs. Today I shared 3 card backgrounds you can create using the mid-century modern stencil. Each one was created using different mediums, giving them each a unique look and feel. I used the one-line holly stamp as my image and shaded each one with watercolors to match the designs. I would love to know which of these backgrounds is your favorite and how you plan on using the stencils with your mixed media collection. These cards gave me an opportunity to pull out some of my pastes and powders and play. Sometimes you just need a reason to grab all those things that you have collected and find a new way to use them. Each of these cards were created as a Christmas design, but you could easily change up those backgrounds and create a card for a birthday or another holiday. I hope that you enjoyed today's project. I will be placing photos of these cards on my blog throughout the next week so that you can grab those and place them on your inspiration boards. If you have any questions about the project or the supplies I used, feel free to post those in the comments below. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to see what you create.